and a 14-year-old to listen to me lecture on about any particular content. So I began to utilize a lot of the tools that were just popping up at that time, learning programs online, computer programs, independent learning platforms. And instead of teaching students the content of those platforms, I spent my whole group time teaching students how to use those platforms, how to teach themselves, how to guide their own learning. I created systems, just like you might do in a kindergarten classroom, to be able to have students check themselves, check their peers, and check in with me so that I could kind of monitor that they were putting in sufficient time. And that helped for things like math, and that helped for things like reading. For things like writing, I would start pulling students into small groups based on their actual level and teach them where they were. I didn't care their age, I cared where they were. And so I would create these small groups, and instead of teaching the whole group, I would teach that small group of students in a pretty traditional way, but again, hearkening back to how you might do it in a kindergarten classroom. These small groups of reading, you bring them back to a table, small groups of writing, and you kind of focus your instruction on the needs of those kids and then move to the next. For science and social studies, I identified something that I had witnessed at that previous gifted and talented public school, which is the students' love for project-based learning and what happens to a kid when they have really participated in the building of their own personal project and they really understand the purpose of it and what to do next. So I started teaching my students how to design their own projects, how to write driving questions, how to do research. None of them had those skills, so it was this point, it was this place where we had the opportunity to kind of teach them something new. And by teaching them that, we were then empowering them to be able to guide their own education. Near the end of the first unit, I chose a big giant theme that I felt like I could connect standards for all the students' instructional levels to, and that theme was culture. And it allowed me to have conferences, conversations with all the different students and find out not just what they already knew about that topic, but what they're really interested in knowing. And so one-on-one with each kid, we started to develop ideas for a final project that we were going to present in front of the community. We set deadlines, we set goals. I always looked at ways that every student could have similar terminology, things like their driving question or their resource list, their materials list. Have you completed your first draft? And all of the things that would allow the younger and the older students to collaborate and work together. And what I found is that for many of the students, for the first time in their life, they got to participate in the act of learning. It wasn't a passive experience, but an active one. I had a student who showed up in those first weeks who hated school. He had been told that he couldn't do it, that he was not successful, and so he rejected all attempts to learn. But when I talked to him, he loved Minecraft. I mean, he loved it. And I saw in this kid the same type of thing that I saw with some of the kids that I was working with in the Department of Family and Children's Services and the Department of Juvenile Justice. I saw that they weren't kids who couldn't learn, but instead they just weren't interested in participating in the structures that these traditional systems had imposed upon them. And so with that kid, his first project was built around his interest in Minecraft. And you could argue if a state or a government authority had come in, they'd come in and say, how does this meet the national standards? But that was not my goal. My goal was to ignite this love of learning in this young man. And once he was able to find success and prove to himself and the community that he could learn, he then ripe for future challenges. The units that came after that were not things that he resisted, because he started to recognize, hey, I can do this and I can learn. During the course of that year, our school started growing little by little, and kids would come. We would go from 7 kids to 12 to 15. I think we got up to 22 or 24 at one point. A lot of these kids were passing through. We would let someone show up for 3 weeks. We would let someone show up for half a year. We would let someone come for half a day. In all ways, we had to be sort of flexible and try to figure out not only this path that would develop lifelong learners, but also something that would work for a really short time as well. And so that first unit on culture, inspired by some of the structures that one of our teachers had spent a lot of times learning with, which is the IB program, inspired by some of their structures, we started recognizing that we should work in these units of investigation. It would give us an opportunity to constantly, as a school and as a class, reflect, get better. It would give us some common terminology from the primary level to the secondary level. And also, for those kids who are only popping in for a short period of time, it would allow them to have a full holistic experience. So we started building the structure of these units. We started building the scope and sequence of a full year, which would go from not just one unit, but 6 individual units of investigation, each one based around standards that we had pulled from international science and social studies standards that would allow us as a school to take this really radical approach to some, but really let our families know, hey, doesn't matter where you're moving from, if you're here from France, Canada, the US, anywhere else, you can be pretty sure that most of the content